In the heart of rural Kansas, where endless wheat fields stretch toward the horizon and the wind carries stories from generations past, lies a tale that will challenge everything you believe about family secrets and the weight of promises. This is the story of Thaddeus Whitmore, a man who spent 4 decades honoring his father's dying wish, only to discover that some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever. Before we begin this incredible journey, hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing tales. Also, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love connecting with our global audience. The Weight of a Promise. The autumn wind of 1983 whistled through the bare branches surrounding the Whitmore farmhouse, a 2-story structure that had weathered nearly a century of Kansas storms. Inside, the smell of cedar and old wood mingled with the antiseptic scent of medicine that had become all too familiar in recent months. Thaddeus Whitmore, then 28 years old, sat beside his father's bed, watching the rise and fall of the old man's labored breathing. Ezekiel Whitmore had been a pillar of strength his entire life. At 67, his hands were still calloused from decades of working the land, his eyes still sharp despite the illness that was slowly claiming him. The cancer had started in his lungs, too many years of dust and pesticides, the doctor had said, and had spread with the ruthless efficiency of a prairie fire. Thaddeus, Ezekiel's voice was barely above a whisper, each word requiring tremendous effort. "Come closer, son." The younger man leaned in, noting how his father's once powerful frame seemed to have shrunk beneath the faded quilt that had belonged to his grandmother. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and sending dried leaves skittering across the porch. "There's something I need you to promise me." Ezekiel's eyes, though dimmed by pain, held an intensity that made Thaddeus straighten in his chair. In the attic, behind the old wardrobe, there's a chest, an old wooden chest with brass corners. Thaddeus nodded slowly. He'd seen glimpses of it during childhood explorations of the dusty attic space, but his father had always steered him away from that corner, always found some other task to occupy his attention. "That chest." Ezekiel paused, gathering strength. "You must promise me, son. Promise me you'll never open it. Never. No matter what happens, no matter how curious you become, no matter what anyone tells you about what might be inside." The room fell silent, except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the whistle of wind through the eaves. Thaddeus studied his father's face, searching for some clue about this mysterious request. Ezekiel had never been a man of secrets, or so Thaddeus had always believed. "Dad, what's in there? Why? Promise me!" Ezekiel's voice cracked with the effort, his weathered hand gripping his son's wrist with surprising strength. Some things are better left alone. Some knowledge brings nothing but pain. Promise me, Thaddeus." The desperation in his father's voice was something Thaddeus had never heard before. This man who had faced drought, flood, economic hardship, and the death of his beloved wife with stoic determination, was pleading with an intensity that bordered on fear. "I promise, Dad, I won't open the chest." Ezekiel's grip loosened, and for the first time in weeks, something resembling peace crossed his features. "Good boy. You're a good son, Thaddeus. Remember that promise. Let it die with me." 3 days later, as a cold November rain pelted the cemetery outside Millbrook, Kansas, Ezekiel Whitmore was laid to rest beside his wife, Sarah, who had passed 5 years earlier from a sudden heart attack. The small gathering of neighbors, fellow farmers, and distant relatives spoke in hushed tones about what a good man Ezekiel had been, how he'd always been willing to lend a hand during harvest season, how he'd never missed a church service until the illness took hold. Thaddeus stood at the graveside long after the others had returned to their cars and trucks, watching the rain turn the fresh earth dark and heavy. The weight of his promise settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, and he found himself wondering what secret could be so terrible that a dying man would extract such a solemn oath from his only son. Returning to the farmhouse that evening, Thaddeus found himself standing at the foot of the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The house felt impossibly quiet without his father's presence, every creak and settle of the old timber frame seeming amplified in the stillness. His hand rested on the banister, and for a moment he considered climbing those stairs, moving aside the old wardrobe and ending the mystery once and for all. But a promise was a promise, especially one made to a dying parent. Thaddeus turned away from the staircase and spent the rest of the evening sorting through his father's papers, trying to make sense of the farm's finances and the weight of responsibility that now rested solely on his shoulders. The chest would remain unopened, its secrets locked away in the dusty darkness of the attic, while life in Millbrook continued its predictable rhythm of planting and harvest, birth and death, hope and disappointment. 40 years of questions. The summer of 2023 found Thaddeus Whitmore, now 68 years old, sitting on the same porch where his father had once watched the sunset paint the wheat fields gold. His own son Marcus sat beside him, along with his daughter-in-law Elena and their 8-year-old daughter Catalina. The little girl was fascinated by the old stories her grandfather told about life on the farm, about the harsh winters and abundant summers, about the community that had once thrived in rural Kansas before economic changes drove so many families to seek opportunities in larger cities. "Grandpa Thaddeus," Catalina said, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. "Mom says there are old treasures hidden in attics. Do you have any treasures in your attic?" The question hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. 40 years had passed since he'd made that promise to his dying father. 40 years during which he'd built a successful farming operation, married his college sweetheart Patricia, raised 2 children, and watched his grandchildren grow. In all that time, the chest in the attic had remained untouched, but never forgotten. Marcus, now 35, and a successful agricultural engineer who lived in Wichita, looked up from his phone. "You know, Dad, I've always wondered about that old chest up there. Remember when I was a kid I asked you about it once, and you got this weird look on your face?" "What chest?" Elena asked, her journalist's instincts immediately piqued. She'd moved to Kansas from Denver 5 years earlier when she'd married Marcus, and she was still discovering the layers of history embedded in rural communities. Thaddeus felt his mouth go dry. Patricia, his wife of 37 years, was inside preparing dinner, and the familiar sounds of domestic life, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the air conditioner, suddenly seemed very far away. "It's nothing," he said quietly, "just some old farming equipment probably." But Marcus was shaking his head. "No, Dad, remember? You specifically told me never to go near it. You made it sound like it was dangerous or something." Catalina's eyes widened. "A dangerous treasure, like pirates." Elena leaned forward, her reporter's notebook forgotten on her lap. "Thaddeus, what's really in that chest? I've lived here for 5 years, and you've never once mentioned it." The pressure of their combined attention felt overwhelming. Thaddeus rose from his rocking chair and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with hands that had grown lined and spotted with age. The wheat fields stretched endlessly before him, just as they had 40 years ago. But somehow the view seemed different now, less certain. "I promised my father I'd never open it," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "But why?" Marcus pressed. "What could possibly be in an old chest that would require that kind of promise?" Elena, ever the journalist, began connecting dots in her mind. "When did your father make you promise this? And under what circumstances?" "He was dying," Thaddeus said, turning back to face his family. "It was 1983. He was riddled with cancer, and 3 days before he passed, he made me swear I'd never open an old wooden chest in the attic. He seemed terrified of what might happen if I did." The porch fell silent. Even Catalina seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, her usual chatter replaced by wide-eyed attention. 40 years, Elena said softly. "You've kept a promise for 40 years without knowing why." "That's love." Patricia's voice came from the doorway as she joined them, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She'd been listening from inside, and her expression held the mixture of pride and concern that had characterized her relationship with her husband's unwavering sense of duty. "That's the kind of man I married." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from his father. "But Dad, don't you think? I mean, after 40 years, maybe whatever your father was worried about isn't relevant anymore. Maybe it was just old documents or something embarrassing from his youth. Or maybe," Elena added gently, "it was something that seemed important in 1983 but wouldn't matter now. The world has changed so much." Thaddeus looked at each of their faces in turn, his son, earnest and logical, his daughter-in-law, curious and compassionate, his granddaughter, innocent and trusting, his wife, supportive but clearly conflicted. For 4 decades, he'd carried the weight of his father's secret alone, but now, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world, that isolation felt suddenly unbearable. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "God knows I've thought about it. Especially after Mom passed 3 years ago. Sometimes I lie awake at night and wonder if I'm honoring my father's memory or if I'm just being stubborn." Patricia moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the easy intimacy of nearly 4 decades together. "What does your heart tell you?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, watching the last rays of sunlight gild the wheat stalks. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook were beginning to twinkle on, marking the transition from day to night, from one chapter of existence to another. "My heart tells me that secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch," he said finally. "But a promise to a dying parent, that's sacred." And died. As the family gathered for dinner that evening, the conversation inevitably returned to the mysterious chest. Elena found herself thinking about the stories she'd covered during her journalism career, family mysteries that had shaped generations, secrets that had been passed down like toxic heirlooms, creating distance and distrust where there should have been love and understanding. That night, as Thaddeus lay beside his sleeping wife, he found himself staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around them. Somewhere above, in the dusty darkness of the attic, the chest waited as it had for 40 years, holding whatever truth his father had deemed too dangerous to share. For the first time since 1983, Thaddeus Whitmore began to seriously consider breaking his promise. The decision that changed everything. 3 weeks after that conversation on the porch, life at the Whitmore farm had taken on an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to address directly. Elena had returned to Denver with Catalina, but not before planting seeds of curiosity that continued to grow in the Kansas soil of Thaddeus's conscience. Marcus had called twice, both times eventually steering the conversation toward the chest, though he tried to be subtle about it. Patricia, meanwhile, had begun to notice changes in her husband that concerned her. Thaddeus had always been a man of routine, up at dawn to check the livestock, breakfast at 7, morning chores until 10, paperwork in his study until lunch. But lately she'd caught him standing at the bottom of the attic stairs at odd hours, sometimes with his hand on the banister, staring upward with an expression she'd never seen before. On a particularly hot July morning, with the temperature already climbing toward 90 degrees by 8 o'clock, Patricia found her husband in his study, surrounded by photo albums and document boxes she hadn't seen in years. The room smelled of old paper and dust, and sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating motes that danced in the still air. "What's all this?" she asked, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Thaddeus looked up from a faded photograph he'd been examining. His face showed the weight of sleepless nights and internal struggle. "Pictures of Dad, documents from when he was young. I've been trying to understand. What kind of secret could be so terrible that he'd make me promise never to discover it?" Patricia leaned forward to examine the photograph. It showed Ezekiel as a young man, probably in his early 20s, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize. They were dressed in their finest clothes, and the woman was beautiful in the way of 1940s movie stars, with carefully waved hair and red lipstick. "Who is she?" Patricia asked. "I don't know. I've never seen this picture before." Found it tucked inside Dad's Bible, along with some other things I'd never noticed. Thaddeus gestured to the items spread across his desk. Love letters, but not from Mom. A wedding ring that doesn't match the one he gave her. A birth certificate for someone named Joshua Whitmore, dated 1944. Patricia felt her breath catch. Joshua? But your father never mentioned having another son. No, he didn't. But according to this birth certificate, Joshua would have been born 3 years before me. Thaddeus picked up one of the letters, his hands trembling slightly. These letters, they're from someone named Constance. And Patricia, she's writing about their son, about Joshua. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Patricia had loved her father-in-law deeply, had respected him as a man of integrity and faith. The idea that he might have had an entire hidden family challenged everything she thought she knew about the Whitmore legacy. Thaddeus, she said gently, maybe this is why he made you promise never to open the chest. Maybe he was protecting Joshua, or protecting you from the knowledge that you had a brother. But why? Thaddeus's voice cracked with emotion. Why would he keep this from me? I had a right to know I had a brother. Joshua had a right to know he had a family. That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, Thaddeus made a decision that would change everything. He waited until Patricia had gone to bed, then climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The space was stifling hot, filled with the accumulated scent of decades, mothballs, dust, old wood, and something indefinable that spoke of time passing and secrets keeping. The old wardrobe stood exactly where it always had, its dark wood surface covered with a fine layer of dust. Thaddeus had to use all his strength to move it aside, his muscles straining and his heart pounding from both exertion and anticipation. Behind it, exactly as his father had described 40 years earlier, sat the wooden chest with brass corners. It was smaller than he'd imagined, about the size of a hope chest, made of what appeared to be cedar. The brass fittings had tarnished to a dull green, and a simple latch held it closed. No lock, no elaborate security measures, just the weight of a dying man's request, standing between Thaddeus and the truth. He knelt before the chest, his knees protesting against the hard attic floor. Lightning flickered outside the small attic window, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. For a moment he could almost hear his father's voice, weak but desperate. "Promise me, son. Promise me you'll never open it." "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered to the dusty air, "but I need to know." The latch opened easily, as if it had been waiting 40 years for this moment. The lid lifted on hinges that creaked but held, and the smell that rose from within was complex. Cedar, old paper, and something floral that might have been perfume from decades past. The chest was filled with carefully organized documents, photographs, and personal items. On top was an envelope with Thaddeus's name, written in his father's distinctive handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it and began to read. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then I have failed to take my secret to the grave as I intended. I hope you can forgive an old man's weakness, but I could not bring myself to destroy these last remnants of a life I lived before you were born. In 1943, I married a woman named Constance Hamilton in a small ceremony in Chicago. We were young and in love, and I believed we had forever ahead of us. Our son Joshua was born the following year, and for a brief time, we were as happy as any family has ever been. But the war changed everything. I was called up for service in the Pacific, and by the time I returned in 1946, Constance had succumbed to tuberculosis. Joshua, barely 2 years old, had been placed in an orphanage. When I tried to reclaim him, I was told he had been adopted by a family in California who wanted no contact with his birth father. I searched for him for years, Thaddeus. I hired private investigators, wrote letters, made phone calls. But Joshua Hamilton, for they had changed his name, seemed to have vanished into the vastness of America. Eventually, I met your mother, and we built a beautiful life together. You were born in 1955, and I convinced myself that Joshua was better off with his adoptive family, that my search would only disrupt whatever happiness he had found. But I never stopped loving him. I never stopped wondering if he was alive, if he was happy, if he ever thought about the father who had failed to find him. These documents, these photographs, these letters from Constance, they are all I have left of my firstborn son. I made you promise never to open this chest because I was a coward, Thaddeus. I was afraid that if you knew about Joshua, you would succeed where I had failed. You would find him, and I would have to face the knowledge that I had given up too easily. I was afraid you would think less of me for abandoning my search, for choosing the comfortable present over the painful past. If you have opened this chest, then perhaps God means for you to succeed where I failed. Perhaps it is not too late for the Whitmore family to be whole again. Your loving father, Ezekiel Whitmore, P.S. The last address I had for Joshua was in Sacramento, California, from 1967. His adoptive name was Joshua Hamilton Chen. His adoptive parents were Robert and Lynn Chen, who owned a small restaurant in Chinatown. Thaddeus sank back on his heels, the letter trembling in his hands as lightning illuminated the attic window and thunder rolled across the Kansas plains. In that moment, everything changed. His father's dying request wasn't born of fear or shame about some terrible secret. It was born of love and regret, of a broken heart that had carried the weight of a lost child for decades. Somewhere in California, if he was still alive, Thaddeus had a 69-year-old brother who had no idea that his birth father had spent years searching for him, had never stopped loving him, had preserved every memory of their brief time together in a cedar chest in a Kansas attic. As the storm raged outside, Thaddeus Whitmore began planning a journey that would either heal a wound that had festered for decades or open new ones that might never heal. But for the first time in 40 years, he understood that some promises, even those made to dying parents, were meant to be broken. The journey to truth. 6 weeks later, Thaddeus found himself standing outside a small apartment complex in Sacramento, California, holding a manila folder containing copies of everything from the chest, photographs, letters, documents, and most importantly, his father's confession. The August heat was different here than in Kansas, drier but no less intense, and the smell of city life, car exhaust, restaurant food, and thousands of lives lived in close proximity felt alien after decades of rural living. Patricia had insisted on coming with him, despite his initial protests that this was something he needed to do alone. After 37 years of marriage, she'd said while packing their suitcase, you don't get to face life-changing moments without me. Besides, if we find your brother, I want to meet him too. The apartment number they sought, 3B, was reached by an external staircase that creaked under their feet. Thaddeus paused at the door, his hand raised to knock, paralyzed by the magnitude of what this moment might mean. What if Joshua was dead? What if he was alive but wanted nothing to do with the family that had abandoned him? What if opening this door caused more pain than leaving it closed? Breathe, Patricia said softly, taking his free hand in hers. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The man who answered their knock was unmistakably a Whitmore. Despite being raised by a Chinese-American family, despite nearly 70 years of separation, Joshua Hamilton Chen had their father's eyes, their father's stubborn jaw, their father's way of tilting his head when he was uncertain. He was shorter than Thaddeus, with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who had worked hard his entire life. But the family resemblance was undeniable. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious but polite. "Are you Joshua Hamilton Chen?" Thaddeus's voice was barely steady. "Yes, I am. And you are. My name is Thaddeus Whitmore. I believe you're my brother." The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Joshua's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, skepticism, and finally, something that might have been recognition. "Whitmore," he said slowly. That name was on my original birth certificate, before the Chens adopted me. He stepped back from the door. I think you'd better come in. Joshua's apartment was small but comfortable, filled with evidence of a full life. Photographs of children and grandchildren, certificates and awards from his career as a high school mathematics teacher, books in both English and Chinese. He offered them tea, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared it, and Thaddeus realized that this moment was just as overwhelming for Joshua as it was for him. I always wondered, Joshua said as they sat in his modest living room. The Chens were wonderful parents. Don't misunderstand me. They loved me as if I were their own blood. But I always wondered about my birth parents. The social worker told me my mother had died, but she said my father had given me up voluntarily. Thaddeus felt his heart break a little more. That's not what happened. Our father, Ezekiel Whitmore, he searched for you for years. He never stopped loving you, never stopped wondering if you were all right. With trembling hands, Thaddeus opened the manila folder and began sharing the contents. Joshua's eyes filled with tears as he looked at photographs of parents he couldn't remember, at love letters from a mother who had died before his memories could form, at evidence of a father who had never forgotten him. He wrote this letter to me, Thaddeus said, handing over Ezekiel's confession. He made me promise never to open the chest where he kept these things. I think he was afraid of what he might discover if the search started again. Joshua read the letter slowly, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he looked up at Thaddeus with an expression of wonder mixed with grief. He looked for me. According to the documents, he hired private investigators until 1967. He never stopped hoping he'd find you. 1967, Joshua repeated. That was the year I graduated high school. The Chens threw a big party for me. I remember thinking that somewhere in the world, my birth parents might not even know I was alive. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. If only I had known. Patricia, who had been quietly observing this reunion, finally spoke. Joshua, you have a family now that wants to know you. Thaddeus has a son and granddaughter who would love to meet their uncle and great-uncle. It's not too late to be part of each other's lives. The next 3 days passed in a blur of conversation, shared meals, and the slow process of building bridges across 7 decades of separation. Joshua had indeed lived a full life. He'd served in Vietnam, become a teacher, married a wonderful woman named Maria, who had passed 5 years earlier, and raised 3 children who had given him 6 grandchildren. The irony, he told them over dinner at his favorite Chinese restaurant, is that I became a teacher because I wanted to help kids who felt lost or forgotten. I never made the connection to my own childhood until this moment. On their last evening in Sacramento, Joshua insisted on cooking for them, a fusion meal that reflected his dual heritage, combining traditional Chinese techniques with heartland American ingredients he'd learned to love during visits to his adoptive extended family. I want to come to Kansas, he said as they shared dessert. I want to see where our father lived, where you grew up. I want to visit his grave and tell him that his search wasn't in vain. Thaddeus felt a weight he'd carried for 40 years finally lift from his shoulders. He would have loved that. He would have loved you. I think, Joshua said quietly, he did love me. Even when he couldn't find me, he loved me. That's what all those photographs and letters were about, weren't they? Love that had nowhere to go. 2 months later, the Whitmore farm hosted the largest family gathering in its history. Joshua had driven from California with his oldest daughter and her family. Marcus and Elena had come from Wichita with Catalina. Neighbors from Millbrook stopped by to meet the brother who had been lost for 70 years and found again through the power of a promise, finally broken. As the sun set over the wheat fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thaddeus and Joshua stood at their parents' graves. The headstones were simple granite markers with dates and names, but no words could have adequately captured the lives they represented. Lives of love and loss, of secrets kept and truths finally revealed, of a family fractured by war and circumstance, but ultimately healed by the courage to face the past. "Do you think he knew?" Joshua asked, placing a bouquet of wildflowers on Ezekiel's grave. "Do you think somehow he knew that breaking your promise would bring us together?" Thaddeus considered the question as the evening breeze rustled through the wheat and carried the sounds of family, children laughing, adults sharing stories, the clink of glasses raised in toasts to second chances and new beginnings. "I think," he said finally, "that love finds a way. It might take 40 years. It might require breaking sacred promises. It might lead us places we never expected to go. But love finds a way." That night, as the last guest departed and the house settled into peaceful quiet, Thaddeus climbed the attic stairs one final time. The chest sat open and empty now, its secrets finally shared, its burden finally lifted. On the dusty floor beside it lay a single photograph that had fallen unnoticed during that stormy night weeks earlier. A picture of two young boys, one dark-haired and serious, one light-haired and laughing, standing in front of a farmhouse that looked remarkably like the one where Thaddeus still lived. He picked up the photograph and studied it in the dim light filtering through the attic window. The boys looked to be about 5 and 7 years old, and though their faces were partially obscured by the passage of time and the limitations of 1940s photography, something about their posture, their way of standing together, suggested brotherhood. The back of the photograph, in his father's careful handwriting, read, "Ezekiel and Thomas, summer 1938. Thomas." Thaddeus sank to his knees as the implication hit him. His father had had a brother too, a brother who had apparently died young before Thaddeus was born. Another family secret, another loss that Ezekiel had carried in silence. But this discovery, instead of opening new wounds, brought with it a sense of completion. His father's desperate need to preserve the memory of his lost son Joshua suddenly made perfect sense. Having lost one brother to the cruelties of time and circumstance, Ezekiel couldn't bear the thought of losing another son to the same forces. As Thaddeus descended the attic stairs for what would be the last time in search of family secrets, he understood that every generation carries the weight of love unexpressed, of connections severed, of words left unspoken. But every generation also has the opportunity to heal old wounds, to build new bridges, to choose love over fear. The chest in the attic was empty now, but the Whitmore family was finally whole. Conclusion. Sometimes the promises we make in moments of grief and love become prisons that hold us captive for decades. Thaddeus Whitmore honored his father's dying wish for 40 years, but in the end, he discovered that the greatest honor he could give to his father's memory was to complete the search that Ezekiel had been too heartbroken to finish. Today, the Whitmore farm hosts regular family gatherings that span generations and continents. Joshua visits every summer, and his children and grandchildren have embraced their Kansas roots with the enthusiasm of those who understand how precious family connections truly are. The chest that once held secrets now holds new treasures. Photographs from family reunions, letters from grandchildren, and evidence of love that refused to be contained by silence. In the cemetery outside Millbrook, Kansas, Ezekiel and Sarah Whitmore rest beneath granite markers that are frequently decorated with fresh flowers, placed there by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they never got to meet, but whose lives they touched through the love they left behind. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for family healing. Subscribe for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in the power of love and forgiveness. And remember, we'd love to know which city you're watching from. Your comments help us build a community of people who believe in second chances and the courage to face difficult truths. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.